Let's have a quick chat about siege socialism. This is something that Michael Parenti wrote about in his book Black Shirts and Reds. Highly recommend that. I've read that, I own that, need to read it again. And something that, kind of Lenin and Stalin and other socialist leaders have alluded to, not necessarily in those exact words, siege socialism, but the concept behind it, which is needing to defend the socialist revolution in the country is of the utmost importance, particularly in taking in the social totality, as Gabriel Rockhill points out, that these socialist countries are situated in a imperialist world, and all of these socialist revolutions have taken place in countries that have been underdeveloped and overexploited by capitalist countries. And sometimes this process of underdevelopment, which obviously underdevelops the third world to overdevelop the first world, has been going on for centuries. And the importance of protecting those socialist revolutions is of the utmost importance, because the imperialist world, the imperialist countries, particularly the United States, uses every tool in their imperialist tool belt to relentlessly and constantly try to undermine the gains of these socialist countries, whether it be through outright military intervention or warfare, or Cuba, for example, with the economic blockade, which has just wreaked havoc on that country for 6+ decades at this point, as well as the US funding different cultural and NGOs and musicians who are trying to undermine the Cuban revolutionary project there. Cultural, like I said, so it takes the imperialists take every level at their disposal to try to undermine these socialist countries and governments. And as Lenin also pointed out, sometimes he had this metaphor or analogy that he shared about a mountain climber who's actually on the mountain trying to get to the top, and there's people down at the bottom saying you should have waited, or you're not climbing it the right way, but they're not actually engaged in the process of climbing the mountain. And this was around the time of the new economic policy in the Soviet Union at that time, which was opening up a bit towards capitalist investment, because again, building up the productive forces in a socialist society, also super important, because if you're not able to meet the material needs of the people, not only the goal of socialism to give everybody a good quality of life, it's going to be a whole lot harder to keep that revolutionary momentum and project going if you're not able to meet the needs of the people in that particular country and nation. And oftentimes, as Rockhill and others have pointed out, there's these ultra leftists, these these socialist utopians who have a whole lot to say, a whole lot of shit to talk about already existing socialist countries, when they're the ones actually living it, right? And it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be a bit messy, but it's very much a process, and there's going to be contradictions involved, and sometimes you have to pivot, like Lenin talked about, and then learn from what's going well, what's not, adapt along the way. But a lot of these people, we could call them, right, the Western Marxists, have a whole lot of shit to talk about countries who are building socialism and learning through doing that, doing the best they can in a imperial world, and against these imperial interests who are constantly working, trying to overthrow their socialist societies and governments, doing the best they can in those really difficult situations, versus these armchair socialists, in the collective West, who aren't living in those conditions, but have a whole lot to say from their, easy boy recliner. So siege socialism, back to that a little bit. And then just contrasting obviously the Western Marxist perspective, who again have a lot of, I'd say not even really, material-based criticisms or critiques of these various socialist projects, but instead just, this utopian idea of what that should be like in practice, versus the Eastern tradition of Marxism, or just, already existing socialism, because Cuba's not necessarily in the East, or, Venezuela, but they're part of that tradition as well, because they're actually, implementing these socialist projects in the context and doing the best that they can with the conditions that they are currently having to deal with, like Cuba under a blockade, because again, the US doesn't want any of these, the US and just Western imperial interests in general don't want these socialist projects to succeed, because they are a threat to imperialist hegemony in the world. So sometimes go as Parenti or Rockhill, we're talking about how the KGB wouldn't have existed if the CIA existed. The USSR wouldn't have had to build up their military to such a capacity if the US wasn't doing at the same time. If the West wasn't constantly trying to overthrow the USSR and have spies infiltrate there and all of the espionage, then the USSR wouldn't have been having to put efforts in there. But again, it was all done within that particular context of trying to protect the gains that had been made, which, again, Che was asked, this was shortly after the Cuban Revolution, what are the two biggest threats facing the Cuban Revolution? He said imperialism and imperialism. So you need a strong state in this transitional phase where the productive forces are being built up, particularly given the social totality that we live in a imperial world, and these imperial interests will stop at nothing, to try to overthrow and sabotage the gains and the progress that these socialist countries have made. Cuba is a great example to what length the imperial interests of the United States have taken and continue to take to try to destabilize and make life so challenging there that the Cuban people would institute some type of regime change effort there. And again, to go back to some type of puppet regime, of the US, like they had with Batista prior to the revolution in Cuba. But again, I traveled to Cuba this end of April of 2024, and the revolutionary spirit is very, very strong still among the people, and it's just really, really powerful to actually go to a socialist country who's working through all of these contradictions in real time, and the government who's actually run by and for the people, and again doing the best that they can in some really difficult situations. And again, not to say that it's a socialist utopia or everything's perfect. That's not reality. That's not the real world. There would never be a socialist project that would live up to the utopian ideals that some of these Western Marxists have, and so they're completely straying away from what Marxism and socialism is all about, right? There's going to be contradictions within any socialist project, as Lenin alluded to. Sometimes you have to compromise and change your tactics in the short term when you're working towards this long-term socialist strategy within the context, within the social totality of the imperial world order. And that's not to say that those countries, that doesn't make them capitalist, because they're having to adapt and change strategy and policy in real time in order to cement these revolutionary gains and protect the socialist state and build up the modes of production and development. So again, China, great example. They have lifted 850 million people out of poverty. As Rockhill pointed out on his, when he was being interviewed by the Already Existing Socialism podcast, that is more than countries in, was it Latin America or South America combined, which is 750 million people. Think about that, more than an entire continent of people China has lifted out of poverty with their socialist government and policies. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think it's very interesting, just this concept of siege socialism. I think it makes a lot of sense given the social totality and that we live in a imperial world with these imperial interests, again, which will stop at nothing to interfere, sabotage, and try to make history of these socialist countries and governments to the greatest extent that they are able to, through all of these different methods that they use in that really despicable process, right? So don't be a armchair socialist if you're not actually looking at the material conditions and the contradictions that are going to inherently exist in building socialism in any country. Then just save it for these people in socialist countries and these governments who by and large are doing the very best that they can in some very difficult situations, as well as learning from prior socialist projects that have made mistakes and trying not to repeat those, like how China is doing right now, really building up the productive factors, and how they had to open up after Mao passed away to gain some capital investment to build up their productive forces with regards to technology. And now we see how that's really paid dividends, and they are able to produce some really high-level technology in these different ways, but then how they've always remained socialist, the Communist Party of China is very much in charge, and at the commanding heights of the economy are still very much state-owned, as well as they have central planning as well. So I think, these so-called Western Marxists or armchair socialists are just that, sitting from their very privileged comforts in the West, while people on the ground, in these socialist countries are doing the best that they can and adapting and pivoting with these contradictions that are going to exist. So Western left, Western so-called Marxists, do better, please.